So here we are for round 4 of answering what I don't really understand why people think are trouble-causing challenges. But they're things that are out there, and they are actually common. The things that he's been saying, that he's been bringing up, and will continue, are things that I regularly encounter unbelievers and skeptics who say these sorts of things, and they think that they're, like earth-shattering reasons why you shouldn't believe in Christianity. And as we've seen, they don't really add up to that. Now, today we actually are going to watch the video. There's 2 shorts. I think it all total is about 10 minutes worth. But he actually plays some videos that I think we need to see. Not all that important that you hear him. I mean, if you can, and I include it on the video that I post on the website. So if you want to actually hear from his own mouth, his argument. But today he plays some other videos that I think are important for us to hear. So,
another question to ask your pastor, apologist, elder. Differences in the gospel accounts lend credibility to the reliability of the gospels. How many times have you heard this? You know how there's differences in, let's say, the birth narrative or the tomb narrative in different gospels. And Christian pastors or apologists will say, well, that lends credibility to the reliability of the gospels. I get that often. So let's listen to J. Warner Wallace again on that.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
Okay, so he's saying that, he's a detective, and he says witnesses never, ever agree. Let me play that again.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
Never, ever agree, except for the times when these supposed witnesses quote each other word for word. This shows that even if you're a Christian who said these are 4 independent gospel accounts, you have to admit, no, at least partially they're not. Whoever wrote Luke had the book of Mark open and copied word for word.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
And when they don't agree in a big, big way. So here is the tomb narrative according to Mark 16. And by the time you get to John, that same tomb narrative explodes to that. It goes from this to that. And so if you look at all the red text, that's the earliest gospel, according to most scholars, in red. And by the time you get to John, these eyewitness accounts, or these accounts compiled by eyewitnesses, or however you want to put it, explodes. And I realize that Christians have solutions. They have harmonizations to make everything fit. But at some point, I think the Christian has to be reasonable and say, I'm always going with the bigger number. I'm always having to expand it. I'm always going to have to say, well, just because he didn't say it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And you constantly have to build upon the narrative from that to that. And at some point, the weight of that idea that you just constantly have to accept and build onto it takes its toll.
So he is addressing this idea of my clicker ain't working. Why isn't my clicker working? Differences in the gospel accounts. Now you saw what he said from J. Warner Wallace. Eyewitnesses never, ever agree. Right? Supposedly, except for whenever they do agree. As we'll get to that in a second. So he's saying that, or what J. Warner Wallace was saying, is that there's these differences, right? And whenever you have witnesses together, they're not going to agree on everything. If you actually listen, and dig into what he says whenever he talks about witnesses. Now here's a guy who, his kind of life study. He is an expert in eyewitness testimony analysis. And he says that if the witnesses all agree, that's a red flag that something's going on. That you're actually not going to have them agree. And so he's saying that these differences are the sorts of things that we would expect to find. It was one of the biggest things for J. Warner Wallace whenever he was examining the Gospels, that he saw these differences and he said, wow, wait a minute. This is exactly how I would expect eyewitness testimony to look. That this is what reliable eyewitness testimony looks like. Now, Doug mentions that there's these places where they do agree, right? And he lists a few: Matthew 8:20, Luke 9:58, Mark 14, Matthew 26, Luke 20, and Mark 12. And these are places where they are word for word identical. And so he's saying, oh, well, you know, you say there's these differences, but there's all these places where they agree. And so therefore, the claim is that it's not actually different accounts, but instead it's just all these copies of the same account. He says that Luke had the Gospel of Mark open and copied word for word. And that might actually be the case. And Luke is not shy about admitting that. In the first chapter of Luke, he flat out says that he has taken it upon himself to compile an account from other sources, from what's been handed down to us. So it's perfectly understandable that he would be referring to Mark. Hey, there's already a gospel out there that was written by Mark, a disciple of Peter. So yeah, he's going to go and get that and use it as a source. That does nothing to kind of discount anything of Luke that might be original that was not in Mark. And actually we see quite a bit of that. But just to kind of point out this idea of witnesses and details. I remember one day, I forget what class it was, I think it was philosophy, and just to prove a point, before class had started, it's a few minutes before class, everyone's kind of milling around and talking, and this guy wanders in, just looked like any other student, had a backpack on, walked up, talked to the professor for a few seconds, and then walked out. And then about halfway through the lesson, he stopped and he said, did anybody notice that kid that came up and talked to me before class? And most everybody was like, oh, yeah, I remember seeing that. And he asked, what color shirt did he have on? Oh, it was blue. No, it was green. No, it was brown. What color hair did he have? Oh, it was black hair. No, it was brown hair. Was it curly? Was it straight? Was he wearing glasses? And there was not agreement between the class. And it just happened like 10 minutes ago. And here you have 20, 30 students who watched it happen, and we can't agree on what color that guy's shirt was. Because this is what eyewitnesses happen. It gets processed, it gets filed away, and kind of your mind fills in the blanks of things you can't quite remember. But we all could agree on the fact that a few minutes before class, this kid walked in, stopped, talked to the professor, and then walked out. Now, we couldn't remember what exact color was his hair, what color was his shirt. You know, was he wearing jeans or khakis? And so those are the kind of details that he says you expect eyewitnesses to not agree on these things. And that's what you see in the Gospels. And so the question that's being offered about whether or not this is eyewitness testimony, whether or not these differences actually lend credibility, well, the question's already been answered. The presenter of this video kind of shot himself in the foot because he played a clip of an expert in eyewitness testimony analysis saying that this is what you expect from eyewitnesses, and this actually lends credibility to it. So he actually kind of proved himself wrong with the clip that he himself chose to play. And so are these really independent accounts? Okay, so he not only just kind of disproved himself by playing the J. Warner Wallace clip, now he's going to go into trying to make his case even more. He says, are these really independent accounts where there appears to be copying going on? Yes. There may be similarities. There may be places where they flat out copied one another. I'm sure it happened. But there's also plenty of places where they contain unique and independent material. There are things that, for instance, in Matthew, you have a story of Jesus healing 2 blind guys. You have a mute demoniac. You have the parable of the lost sheep. None of that occurs in the other Gospels. In Luke, you have James and John. Remember, they want to call down fire on a village. They're passing through, and the village says, no, don't stop here. Just keep going. And they tell Jesus, hey, you want us to call down fire on the village? That only appears in the story in the account of Luke. The sending of the 72, a few weeks ago, we talked about that on Sunday morning, only appears in Luke's account. The parable of the Good Samaritan only appears in Luke's account. In John, the water into wine, the woman at the well, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, only appears in John. So yeah, there's things that they have in common. There's things that they probably even copied from one another. But they each also have independent individual information that the other 3 do not have. They are independent accounts. Even if they shared some information, overall, their sources are independent. And so the real fun one is this tomb narrative. And if you look at one of those pieces of papers I gave you, it has the full color thing that he was showing there. So this idea, and it's kind of common, there's this idea out there that the Gospels are, they evolve, they progress. That Mark wrote first, and then Matthew copied from Mark and added some stuff, and then Luke copied from Matthew and added some stuff. And by the time you get to John, it's a whole different story with all kinds of ideas. They'll say things like, well, back in Mark, the idea of Jesus being God was really kind of, not a lot of it. Whereas by the time you get to John, it's just all about, he was the Word become flesh, and just all this about Jesus being God. And so they say, well, that's an evolution of the legend over time through the Gospels. And that's what he's pointing at. And he says, hey, look, here's this color-coded thing. The ones in red, well, that's what Mark wrote. So it's just a few things, just a little bit. And then in Matthew, it gets a little bit more. And then in Luke, it gets a little bit more. And by the time you get to John, you have this whole big, more developed story that supposedly evolved over time. Well, what's funny about that, okay, is this view, this progression, supposedly, doesn't really stand up when you look at other passages. For instance, if you were to look at the story of Barabbas, the order changes. If you're going based on who gives minimal data and this idea that the story is evolving into the big produced, one, well, then you'd be starting with John. So according to the tomb narrative, they say John is the last one, but according to Barabbas, John offers the slightest bit of material. And then you'd go through Mark and Luke, and Matthew has the biggest, most developed story account of Barabbas. If you look at Jesus and his conversation with Pilate, you get a different order also. And so, whereas Luke has just a short conversation, and if you're only reading Luke, you kind of wonder, what are they talking about? Because there's details that are left out. And then Matthew has more, Mark has more, and John has this whole big exchange back and forth, talking to Jesus, out to the Pharisees, coming back to Jesus, and that isn't in the other 3. And so you can actually rearrange the order of the Gospels depending on what passage you're looking at. And so this idea that you develop, that the story developed over time, you can pick any story and rearrange the order that they supposedly developed. And so this whole idea of a progressive or evolving story through the Gospels just does not hold weight. Okay, so he talks about these. I'm trying to think how he worded it. Like these problems, you're constantly having to try to come up with answers and make reasons why things fit. And he says, this is burdensome. The Christian, if you're reasonable, that you have to recognize this is burdensome. Well, it's really not burdensome. I would say, trying not to be too cheeky about it, is that what's burdensome is dealing with these superficial, made-up challenges from critics who seem to be just looking for something that gets a little burdensome, right? Is it unreasonable? No, it's not unreasonable. It's actually perfectly reasonable to think that there are differences in the Gospels and that these differences lend credibility to it being eyewitnesses. And should this cause doubt? And I think you know where my answer is on that. No, this is nothing. These differences in the Gospels is absolutely nothing that should cause any kind of anxiety or doubt or tension in a believer. So, kind of ran through that, but any thoughts or questions on that idea of these differences in the Bible? It's one thing I like, and I think they're actually fun. You know, just like on Sunday mornings, as we're preaching through the Gospels, when I come across differences, oh, hey, let's look at these differences and explain what they mean, see why they're different. And 9 times out of 10, they're just different details of the story, you know? And so, okay, well, that is that one. So, let me do this so that I don't break anything. Play this other part, play this video for part 2. Okay, so the issue here is about the manuscripts, right? We've talked before about manuscripts and how there's just, just tons and tons of copies, handwritten copies of the New Testament documents for over centuries of time. And so he's going to address this argument a little bit.
Oh, okay. Manuscripts. How many times have you heard this? The thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament point to its historical reliability. Ask your pastor, your favorite apologist, your elders, this question. And I think they're going to, actually, I am very curious to see how they would answer this. But let me play a clip from Frank Turek.
What are they in agreement on?
This is when it comes to manuscripts, this is a blurb from Frank talking about Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman. A lot of Christians hate Bart Ehrman because he's effective. And this is a famous quote that apologists throw out.
He and I were put into a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like. There would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Well, why would you write misquoting Jesus then? Not you, but Bart Ehrman, right?
Right. Well, the reason Ehrman says that his position is not at odds with the essential Christian belief is, well, first of all, what is the essential Christian belief? That Jesus rose from the dead, is it not? I think most Christians would say that. It's because the resurrection is a theological belief, not a historical one. History is about what probably happened in the past, and miracles are the least probable event. So that's why Bart Ehrman says what he says about Bruce Metzger, that the belief in the resurrection is a theological one. That's believed based on, some people say, faith. And it can't be answered by the historical method. So again, please don't use manuscripts to say, well, Jesus rose from the dead. 43% of the 8,000 New Testament verses are in manuscripts. This is from Frank Turek's own video. 43% are before the year 225 AD. Another way to look at it is 50% of the New Testament verses are after 2 centuries, 200 years after the purported events. Over 5,700 Greek and 19,000 manuscripts in other languages, blah, 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 blah. You hear this time and time again. If I was to take a piece of paper and write, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," handwrite it, have I just created a manuscript of the New Testament? Well, Doug, this is the year 2018, so that's a silly question. Okay, the year is now 900 AD, and I write, I find a text, a text that says, "For God so loved the world," and I take my own pen and I write, "For God so loved the world," And then I also speak another language, and I copied that in a different language as well. Now I got two. How in the world what I just did in 900 AD helps to say that anything that I've written is, number one, true, or that what I copied it from was copied correctly from wherever that came from? It doesn't. And so when apologists and pastors say that, oh, just look at all the manuscript evidence and nothing else even comes close in history, that says nothing about its veracity, whether or not it's true. And if you look at a lot of what apologists and pastors say, the smart ones are very careful in how they word it. They'll say, well, that just means that each copy is consistent with the other. But the not so smart ones will basically say this shows that we can trust it. So let me play a clip of William Lane Craig saying that exact same thing.
Now, let me just be very clear about this. That doesn't prove that the text is true. This doesn't prove that the text is historically accurate. It's just to say that we know what 99% of the original wording of these documents was.
Keep in mind, we don't have the original documents. So I think William Lane Craig is using the word know very loosely here. How can we say with 99% confidence, at least, that it matches the originals when we do not have the originals?
So you see, that's not the same as saying that it's established with historical accuracy. Sometimes Christians make this mistake. It's just to say that we now know what 99% of the original words in the New Testament were, and that 1% that's still somewhat uncertain are just utter trivialities on which nothing hangs.
Utter trivialities. Well, there's definitely some manuscript differences that are not trivial, like the ending of Marc. The first gospel written ends in a cliffhanger with the women telling no one of the empty tomb. Another thing you can bring up with your pastor, apologists, elders is the distribution of manuscripts. That I think it's over 90% of all the manuscripts that we have for the New Testament are 1,000 years after the purported event. 1,000 years. Whenever, I don't think Christians, if you're listening this far, I don't think you have a choice anymore. I think every time you hear the word manuscript from this day forwards, and if you've never heard this before, this is going to stick in your head. 1,000 years later. Whenever a Christian is going to, or a pastor apologist says the word manuscript, you're going to think 1,000 years later, the vast, vast, vast majority of these manuscripts that we have are from that time period, 1,000 years later. Daniel Wallace acknowledges it should be pointed out that most of our manuscripts come from the second millennium, not century, millennium AD, and most of our manuscripts do not include the New Testament. If one excludes later medieval manuscripts, Wallace notes that only approximately 124 manuscripts come within the 2nd to 4th centuries CE, which is considerably a smaller number. So when you see that, 5,700 Greek and 19,000 manuscripts in other languages, I want you to think that, 124.
Okay, so, and this is something that you will hear often. He's right. This is something that preachers and apologists and Christian teachers will talk about, is the embarrassment of riches that Christianity has for copies of the Bible. That we just have thousands of them in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in Coptic, in just name the language of the ancient world. They're in there. We've got tons of them all over the place, and so it is something that gets mentioned a lot. Now, this is his statement that the thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament point to its historical reliability. And he argues, says, no, it doesn't. And I'm actually going to agree with him. The point of all of the manuscripts is not to say, well, because we have so many, therefore you can trust it. Therefore it's true. Because we have so many copies, therefore it's true. That clip he played from William Lane Craig, who is probably the prominent, currently like today, he is the prominent Christian philosopher, academic. There was one atheist who debated him, who referred to him as the Christian who puts the fear of God in atheists whenever they debate him, because he's that smart, that good. But he's pointing out, just by saying that the point about the manuscripts is that we can reliably reconstruct what the original said. Now, that doesn't go all the way to say, therefore it's true, but it's a really big step in that direction. Because one of the number one challenges that I hear people about Christianity and about the Bible is it's been changed. Over the years, it's been translated and copied so many times. There's all these changes. You can't trust what it says. You don't know what it said, what the originals wrote. Well, actually, yes, we can. That's why having all of these copies comes in handy. And so he plays this clip from Frank Turek. Frank Turek is another popular kind of, I'd say, leading, maybe, apologist teacher. He's a really in-demand speaker and teacher on these issues. And he talks about quoting Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic, probably leans towards atheist, used to be an evangelical. I think he used to actually be a minister. And he, got to studying things and got out and decided he didn't believe anymore. But there's this idea that the essential Christian doctrines are not affected by the textual variations in the manuscripts. We've talked about this before, that if you look at the number of variations, there are a round number, 400,000 variations in the New Testament. But every single time there's any kind of variation, it could be a spelling error. That counts as one. Right? It could be they wrote Jesus Christ, and this one over here wrote Christ Jesus. That's a variation. Right? So even those sorts of things is what they're counting. And like they even said, the vast majority of them, something like 99.9 whatever percent of them, are meaningless. They've got nothing to do with anything. They're spelling errors, they're typos. They're where cities will have different names. Right. So the Greeks might call this city one thing and the Romans call it something else. And so you'll have two different names that get used. Sea of Galilee is also called the Sea of Tiberias, but it's talking about the same body of water. Right. Those are variations. They don't mean anything. And the variations we do have that we can look and go, okay, yeah, that's actually, that they're different. They're saying two different things. These two copies do not match up. They don't touch anything like the Trinity or the resurrection or the deity of Christ or any of that. And so, all right, so let's go through some of these claims that he makes. He says that the resurrection is a theological claim. It's a theological belief. It's not a historical one. Well, but the claim is that the resurrection was an actual event that took place in history. There was a real person who really died on a cross, really got buried, and really came back to life. That is a historical event. It can either be confirmed or refuted by historical evidence. So no, it's not a theological claim. The theological claim is for them to say, no, you can't believe stuff like that. We have to find a different idea. Now, that's a theological claim. Christians are actually a little more open-minded than atheists when it comes to examining stuff like this, because for us, all options are on the table. For the atheists, they say, no, those supernatural things, those miraculous things, no, those can't be considered. They're actually a little more closed-minded than the Christian on this stuff. It says the question of the resurrection cannot be answered by the historical method. Again, why not? If it's an event in history, the historical method examines it. It says history is about what probably happened, which is true. We weren't there. We have to kind of piece it together and kind of figure it out. And a miracle is the least probable event. The idea of miracles, by definition, a miracle is going to be rare. Right? I mean, if miracles were happening all the time, all over the place, they wouldn't be special. Kind of the point is, miracles are rare, so they're saying, by definition, the normal thing that happens is not a miracle, so the miracle is the least likely candidate. However, rare does not mean less probable, does not mean less likely. If it's what best fits the evidence, then that is your answer. But see, the skeptical mind is automatic doubt, automatic disbelief. And so if you piece it together and you look and you say, here's the evidence, and the resurrection is the best explanation, which it is, and they go, well, hold on, there's got to be some other explanation. Any other explanation you can come up with, they will think that's automatically better than a miracle. But that, again, is their belief idea. That didn't have to do with the actual evidence and the actual claims of history. Simply copying something centuries later does not make it true, nor does it mean that what I copied from was true. Okay. Remember that very important question, that someone will drop a statement like this to you, and you have to remember that very important question. Okay, and what? Because people will throw out things like this, like they just drop some profound, just intellectual bomb on you, but it doesn't actually mean anything. Like nothing follows from that. If the question is whether or not the New Testament documents are reliable, simply making the observation that, well, you know, if I write something down later or if I copy something, that doesn't mean it's true. Well, of course it doesn't mean it's true. But it also doesn't mean it's false. It actually has no bearing on the question whatsoever. We have to actually examine the historical events themselves. Just simply having the copy, again, doesn't make it true or false. Any thoughts or questions? I don't want to just steamroll on past. I want to give you a little time to think and ask. I mean, because these are things that some folks think are very persuasive for Christianity supposedly being wrong. So he plays the clip by William Lane Craig, who basically just admits, the point we're making about all the manuscripts isn't to say therefore it's true. We're just saying that we can have a pretty good, accurate idea about what the original said. And then from there, you analyze historically about whether or not it's true. The claim he makes is that you cannot say that you know it matches the originals if you do not have the originals. Well, we can have a pretty high degree of confidence in its accuracy, right? This is the entire field of textual criticism. There are thousands of historians that this is what they do, not just with the Bible, with any historical document, where they take the copies and they look at the differences and they try to figure out the differences and why they're different, and the older ones are probably the ones that are more accurate, and they try to piece together what did the original actually say and look like. This is not uniquely a biblical thing. If this right here, what he says is true, we can't know anything about history. There is no historical document that we can trust or believe, and so therefore anything that's written down, any historical evidence that comes from a document, we might as well just throw it out the window and forget about it, because if his standard is true, we can't know anything. Of course, that's not true, right? Historians the world over would agree about things like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great and different events throughout history that we have far less material about than we have for the Bible. If you remember, a few weeks ago I gave this example of Aunt Sally's secret sauce. Right? It's like, let's say Aunt Sally had this secret recipe and she wrote it down and copied it and gave it to 3 of her friends, and then they let 10 of their friends copy it, and then she lost her recipe to her magic, beauty serum that kept her young. And then she went to her friends, and they lost theirs too. So they gathered up all the other copies that everyone else had copied. And they found out that some were missing ingredients, some had the steps of the recipe out of order, some had things that just weren't even in there in the original, right? Some were, coffee stains and things were smeared and you couldn't read. Some had things torn off. But if you put them all together, you can kind of piece together what the original said. Right? This is kind of common sense. We do this automatically in something. If you ever send a text message and you misspelled something, what do? Never happens.
Thank you, autocorrect.
Right? It'll misspell them for you, right? It'll make up new things you weren't trying to say, right? But you turn around and you send another text message, okay? If you're on the receiving end of that, you look at the first one, you look at the second one, you go, okay, that's what they meant. And now imagine that you have someone who is just really OCD perfectionist, and the first one they sent you was wrong. I have to correct that. So they just resend you the next message. And then that one had a different error. And then, that just bugged them. So they had to resend it again. And you end up with like 10 different messages, but they all have different errors. Could you piece together what it was they were trying to say, despite all the little errors? Right? That's textual criticism. That's exactly what historians do. And so he's trying to say you can't know if it matches the originals if you don't have the originals. Yes, we can. This is the work of historians, regular day-to-day, and even especially a Christian thing. It's just what historians do. So it's kind of a weird claim. Okay. Says some of these differences are not trivial. Right? William Lane Craig says they're trivial differences. Spelling errors. Right? There are things about the name of a city, stuff like that. And he says, no, these are not all trivial. You have things like the ending of Mark. And he says that the Mark abruptly ends with the women not going and telling anybody. But you pointed out there's actually quite a bit that follows. Well, here's the thing. Most scholars think that the ending of Mark is an addition. It was not part of the original. That whether it was lost somewhere, that it got torn off, whether someone just didn't like it, or whatever it was, the very earliest copies that we have of Mark do not have those last, I think it's 11 verses. And then later on, they have them. And so a lot of scholars think, okay, well, someone, the original ending maybe got lost, and then some scribe down the road figured that can't let it end like this, and so they, finished out the story. Well, but here's the thing about that. There is, even if that's true, and those last, I think it's 11 verses of Mark were added later, nothing in them is false. Every single detail in the ending of Mark is mentioned somewhere else, and actually perfectly fits the story of Jesus and other information that we get from other writings. There's nothing in there that would be unique and false. It's all repeated somewhere else. And so that wouldn't actually change anything. So even if the ending of Mark is a later addition, it's trivial because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't alter any theology. There's nothing in Mark that then would turn around and have you say, oh, well, this is a different account of Jesus. It's teaching something else. No, it agrees with everything else in the New Testament. And all the details, as best as I can tell, are actually repeated somewhere else. So maybe just some, motivated scribe didn't like the ending, so he took, the other information he already knew and just crafted one and stuck it on there. That's possible. Either way, it doesn't actually change or affect anything theologically. This one's fun. 90%, I'm not sure about that number, but he says 90% of the manuscripts come from 1,000 years after. Right? Because this is a big thing that we like to talk about. That we have, not only do we have more manuscripts than anyone else in history, that the Bible has earlier manuscripts than anyone else in history. But he points out, and this is true, what he's saying here is not false. This is actually true data. That the bulk, the big, just lion's share of copies we have come from the second millennia. They come after 1,000 years. Does anyone know what happened around the year 1000 AD? Or why we would have? No, that's going to come a few hundred years later. These are hand-copied manuscripts. Paper, they probably had some, developments in paper. This is around the time that you had the rise of monasticism, monasteries, monks, who one of the main things they spent their time doing was copying Scripture. So now all of a sudden, after the year 1000, is about when you have this explosion of all these copies. Why? Because you got monasteries all over Europe filled with monks who are just sitting around copying stuff. That's why we have tons more that come later, but we do have earlier. Right? It's not as if we just all of a sudden, poof, everything pops up 1,000 years later. We have early copies. Not as many, because sorry?
Question. So were there additional books written at that time where it's just there's more copies?
It was just more copies. It was more copies. By that time, because I think it's by about 300, 400, or actually earlier than that, but officially on paper, church council decided and verified and ratified. We had the Bible, the 27 books of the New Testament, really early on. Within 2 or 3 centuries of Jesus, they were pretty much widely agreed upon, and everybody said, these are the canon, the actual inspired Word of God. And so, no, but by 1000 AD, anyone tried to introduce a new book, they would have gotten probably excommunicated or burned at the stake. That's how they did it back then. So, okay. But we get to say that all-important question, okay, so they were all 1,000, or a bulk of them are 1,000 years later. And what am I supposed to gain from this? Notice, now I don't want to try to assign nefarious motives to him. I don't know if he realized he was doing this, but he seemed to stress very importantly that number 1,000 years sticks in your head. Whenever someone mentions manuscripts, I want you to think 1,000 years later. Right? It's like he's training you to the suggestion that this is what's going to pop in your head. So whenever a preacher gets up and says, we have early manuscripts, 1,000 years, right? And so that's going to be what jumps up in your head. And he even quotes Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace is probably one of the leading Bible scholars in the world today. And he even points out that most of these come from 1,000 years later, and that the manuscripts we have from the 2nd to 4th century are only about 124 manuscripts. So whenever someone stands up and says, we have over 5,000 full Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and you think 1,000 years later, well, we only have about 124 that come from closer to the time of Jesus. Ooh, only 124? Wow, that's a much smaller number. Because we're talking, something like 5,800. Oh, that's whittled down to 124. And again, he stressed that 124. Only 124. He's trying to get you where that's going to pop in your head whenever you think about this. What's interesting is he tries to kind of pit Dan Wallace against Frank Turek. Frank Turek probably gets most of his information from Dan Wallace. Okay? That's probably the go-to Bible scholar that Frank Turek is quoting. These figures that he's quoting right here are probably from Dan Wallace. So it's really interesting that he's trying to pit the two against each other. But let's just take it. Let's just say, okay, Dan Wallace's figure, 124 manuscripts, is completely right. Let's say, within the first couple hundred years of Jesus, all we have from that early is 124 manuscripts. It doesn't disprove anything here. 43% of New Testament verses are in manuscripts earlier than 225. Yeah, they are. That's a lot of verses. Half the Bible that we have dated back that early. Okay, he says, oh, well, all these Greek and manuscripts and other languages, those don't really count because most of them were later. Well, most of the Greek manuscripts were later. A lot of the other languages are very early. We have things that were copied into the other areas. Because remember, the church, kind of early on, they took on Latin and said only Latin, and you weren't allowed to copy the Bible. So in the first few hundred years is when we actually get it translated into all these other languages. So even if the copies of those languages are a little later, we know it was copied early on. And so, I mean, if you take a Latin copy of the New Testament from Rome and you compare it to a Coptic copy from Egypt, and you put them side by side and you go, wow, hey, they still match up, even though they're separated by several centuries and several thousand miles. They still match up. That's a pretty impressive. That means nothing's getting changed. I love this because I don't know if you noticed. He started to read through point number 2, and then he trailed off, blah, 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 so on, so on. Well, gee, why would he not want to mention the fact that over 36,000 quotations from early church fathers exist? Early church fathers, meaning 1st and 2nd century, 3rd century, that they were quoting the Bible. Here's a quote that he doesn't mention from Dan Wallace, who says that we have so many quotations of the New Testament from the early church that you can recreate the New Testament several times over, just from the quotations of the early church fathers. We have those. We didn't want to mention that. And then there is the accuracy, because we can figure out. We have so many copies. We know where the changes were made, when they were made, and which is most likely to be the original. And we can piece that together with a very high degree of accuracy. But let's just say, I love this. All right, he wants to point out and say, only 124. Only 124. Where did my... Uh-oh. Where's my... Did I not have... I guess I didn't have it in there. That table you have, where it has the different authors and when they wrote and all that kind of stuff. This is very common. Just about any kind of presentation or book or anything that you're going to read about the Bible being reliable, you're going to find this information. This is comparing how the Bible manuscripts stack up against other ancient histories. So let's say that we take those 90% from 1,000 years later off the table, and all we're looking at is, let's say all we have is that 124 manuscripts. Look at that last column there, number of manuscripts. If you don't count Homer, because he's like in a league of his own with those other guys, but if you don't count Homer, all these other ones, well, they don't have a lot of manuscripts either. I mean, the average here is 175. Well, we got 124. We're right there in the same ballpark with every other historical writing of the time. So what does that do? Nothing. We're just in the same ballpark as every other historical writing. And they don't find these problematic. They will read these historical documents and say, these are reliable. They use these to form history. If you open a history textbook, the information you're going to find in there are from these historians. They find them credible and reliable. Okay, so we only have 124 manuscripts. All right, so does everybody else. Right about the same number. But look at the time gap, because that's a very important thing. When was the first one written, and when is the earliest existing copy? The two closest, besides the Bible, are Sophocles at about 100 to 200 years, and Thucydides at about 200 years. The average time gap is 695 years. What's the time gap for the New Testament? What does it say? 40. Okay, so we're right there neck and neck on par with everyone else with our number of manuscripts, but look at what that time gap. We'd blow them all out of the water. So even if, hey guys, whenever you hear manuscript, I want you to think 1,000 years, and there's only 124. Okay, Well, even by those standards, the Bible is still far ahead and above all the other historical documents, which no one else is being so skeptical about. They don't doubt those. They don't say, oh, no, you cannot trust Herodotus. Right? They're not saying the Caesar's Gallic Wars, we got to question that. No, the Bible, even with the low numbers he's arguing for, the Bible still has better cred. The Bible still has higher qualifications. So, what exactly is it he's trying to prove? Because even by his lowered standards, the Bible's still top dog. And is showing itself to be reliable and accurate. So, thoughts? Questions? No?
I think he's just really trying to throw doubt in the minds of people who really don't know.
He is. He really is, and I wouldn't suggest you do, but if you were to go watch some of his other videos, it's exactly what he does. Exactly what he does is to cast doubt. And actually on his website or on his YouTube channel or whatever, his little tagline is, doubt is a virtue. He wants to cause doubt. You look at the way he forms his questions. It is, well, hey, now how does that make you feel? What do you think about that? But whenever you actually apply some rationality and reason to his claims, they fall apart. But he argues with rhetoric and emotional appeal that people who don't know, they're going to go, oh, 1,000 years later, man, that's a long time. It is a long time. Only 124, wow, that's not very many. And so these ideas, right? That if someone hasn't really thought about them, hasn't been taught how to think about them, that doesn't know a lot, it can quite easily derail their faith. And so, and that's why, notice the name of our little series of responses to his claims is called It's No Trouble at All, because the title of the video that we're responding to is How to Cause Trouble in Church. And what's funny is, and I'll have to admit, this stuff doesn't often get preached from pulpits, and I don't know how much it usually gets covered in Sunday school classes and stuff, but anyone who's been to any Bible college knows this. These are elementary, these are like first year Bible college, right? This isn't even like PhD, doctoral study stuff. This is like freshman Bible 101 stuff. That anyone who's going to be standing up in a pulpit and telling you, thus saith the Lord, right? We know this stuff. We studied it, and we know there's no problem here. Probably one of the reasons it doesn't get taught much is because it's not really an issue. But if you come at it from a certain angle with people who don't know better, it can cause trouble. And that may be a weakness that preachers have fallen into, where we, maybe have a blind spot where we don't see where those angles might come in, because these really are non-issues. But if someone doesn't know it's a non-issue, then maybe they could get tripped up, which is why I'm teaching this, why I think it's important. So, alrighty, we are about out of time. Any last thoughts, comments, questions? Okay.